Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. You know, there are an estimated 60 million adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse in the United States. 1 in 10 young people will be abused by the age of 18. This startling statistic, along with the rampant abuse being uncovered by churches, schools, business leaders, professionals, family members, and close friends, is at an epidemic level. We're all struggling with understanding how hope can be found even in our darkest hurts, how to protect our families from potential predators, and when to speak up. Lies people who have been abused often believe, and where is God when someone is being abused, especially when the abuser is an authority or in the church? Those answers and more are what Nanette Kirsch answers in her new book, Denial: Abuse, Addiction, and a Life Derailed. Nanette's passion for living out Ernest Hemingway's directive to write the truest sentence you know led her to major in journalism at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and pursue a career in communications. She's the owner and president of Big Rock Ideas, an outsourced inbound marketing company where she helps companies discover and express the essence of their brand identities. While writing is a large focus of her business, she began a blog, Faith Runner, journaling to the heart of what is true, to share life lessons she's learned, walking with God as a wife for 25 years, mother of 4, businesswoman, and Christian witness. Here to share the true story of a life destroyed by abuse in her new book, Denial: Abuse, Addiction, and a Life Derailed, based on a true story, is Nanette Kirsch. Nanette, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Hi, Eric. Thank you very much for having me.
You're very, very welcome. We run a feature every month on healing from abuse with Dr. Ramona Probasco, who has an abuse recovery center in California and has written a book called Healing Well from Abuse. And she was in a physically abusive relationship, but the manifestation of recovering from any abuse, whether it be sexual or physical, really manifests itself in the same way, and that is the self-recrimination, the hiding, the shame, the masking, the denial, all of that wrapped up into one. I want to take you back to your early years when you got this calling to become a writer, and how that merged with your faith journey, and why you took what was foundationally an education in journalism from an esteemed university that those of us who are from Pittsburgh hold in high regard, but the world doesn't know a lot about Duquesne University. My sister actually graduated there with her law degree from Duquesne. But what really was the place where all this came together? Faith and writing and living out and journaling out your faith journey.
That's a great question. I love to write. I was editor of my high school newspaper, ironically mentored by the same teacher who was my abuser in high school, but it did not deter my passion for writing. I wasn't particularly talented at it at the time, I don't think, but I just loved it, and I found it a great way to express myself. I enjoyed the craft on a business level, but as I got older and I grew in my faith, I really felt the Lord calling me to use that in ministry. And so I started the blog and didn't really have a great idea about how I was going to do it, except that I had really developed a passion for Scripture and wanted to share what I was learning. So it's a very simple weekly commitment to just share how God's moving in my life. It seems to resonate with the people who follow it. And then I've also just answered God's call to use my writing in other places. One example is a friend of mine's son was incarcerated, and I didn't know what to do to support them. And I felt the Lord say, write. That's what you do. Just write. So I write him every week or two and do the same thing, share God's movement in my life and try to be an encouragement.
Nanette, where was your foundation of faith formed, and when did it become your own?
That's also a good question. I grew up Roman Catholic. I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, which is 80% Catholic. So I was almost done with middle school before I realized there were any people who weren't Catholic, aside from my sweet Jewish grandparents that were my parents' best friends. So I didn't really question that faith. I always knew the Lord. I actually found an item in my first grade First Communion program that said that I didn't want any gifts because I had the gift of Jesus in my heart, which was an answer to prayer to really know when I had accepted Christ into my heart. But we had moved to Texas when I was in my early 40s, and we became part of a church start there. And the pastor who was starting that church met with me because I was trying to figure out how to use my gifts more for the Lord, and I had no assurance. And realized that I was terrified of what was going to happen to me when I died, and that even though I thought I knew God, I did not have a true relationship with him. And that really started the journey. I think Texas is just a great repository of faith. There's so many people of faith there, and they're so much more outspoken about it than how I grew up in the North. And so that really was what started my transformation.
So did you continue in the Catholic Church, or did you enter into the Protestant denomination category?
Yeah, ironically, I left the Catholic Church in the early 2000s when the sex abuse scandals first started to break in the Pittsburgh area. We were living there at the time, and I was appalled by what I saw happening. I was appalled by the fact that the church was paying people off and not addressing the issue. And my husband grew up in the Methodist faith, and so we migrated pretty naturally and easily to that. And I continue to. Now, most of my family is still Catholic, and so I respect the faith and the things that it gave me and the people of faith in there who are good. But I also think that it's deeply corrupted right now in light of the information that's coming out, first in Boston, then most recently in the grand jury report in Pennsylvania. And so I'm trying to be a beacon for change in a way that does not disrespect people of faith who are still in that denomination.
Well, you make the point in the book that although some of this does statistically tie into this outrageous situation that happened in Boston that was the subject of a documentary. And my question would be to you, if you knew about the Boston situation and you had been personally a victim of sexual abuse, why did it take another large expose and another large exposure of a rampant fundamental principle or concept within the Catholic Church to prompt you to leave it? Why wasn't Boston enough?
I actually didn't know about Boston first. The first thing I knew of was when it started to break in Pittsburgh, which was around 2002. And that was before the Boston situation broke, I believe, from a timing perspective. It also was close to home. It was affecting, priests that I was friends with and went to college with and people who I knew. And I saw the cover-up happening. So I found out about the Boston situation sort of around the time that Spotlight was released. So it definitely reconfirmed. I tend to be someone who's more oriented to advocate for change from within than just to leave. But it's become really clear to me that that's not possible right now in the Catholic Church. I did say in the preface of the book, which was written, I actually wrote that a couple of years ago, that draft of the preface, I would rewrite it now. At the time, I firmly believed, and I still think there's truth in the fact that there's a paradigm to abuse that has to do with people in power who are given access and respect and privileges that they don't earn, right? When a pastor moves into a small town, at least back in the day when this story happened, that was like having God's right-hand man show up in your town. And so nobody questioned who he was or if it was safe or good for your children to be allowed to be with them. Hopefully that's no longer the case, but that happened not just in Catholicism, but in many denominations. What to me has become glaringly apparent in the light of the grand jury report in particular is that this is a culture that has gone past being a cover-up or corruption of a handful of people, that it's a culture that has really deeply infected that denomination. And so I do think it's a more significant issue there than in some other places.
It is devastating to a Jewish believer to know that one half of the world's profession of faith in Jesus are linked to a denomination that was complicit in the Holocaust, that for the first 21 years of my life, blamed the Jews for killing Jesus, and it wasn't until 1973 that they recanted and stopped blaming the Jews for killing Jesus. So the way we perceive that was, at least you confessed that for 1900 years you've been blaming us for killing Jesus. So the perception and reception and presentation are often quite different of what they thought they were saying is to what the Jewish mind hears was something completely different. And you know, Pittsburgh is a Catholic city. I grew up in a very large Jewish community surrounded by that Catholic city. And I remember the first time I was called a Christ killer, I went running home and saying, listen, I've been accused of killing somebody and I don't even know who they are. I was Jewish.
Yeah.
Jesus was not, he was the God of the Gentiles, if there was any reference whatsoever. And so when I came to faith at age 44, I had to reconcile myself to whether or not I would identify as a Christian, as is that the same connection, and within Christianity, this Reformation, did that change the fact that the world still perceives that there is only one leader of the Catholic Church, and that of the Church, and that's the Pope, because no other denomination has a vocal, visible, world-watching and world-established leadership. But to your point, the power, the authority, and the status of a leader, whether or not the president of a company, whether or not a Harvey Weinstein, whether or not a pay-to-play kind of environment where the carnal nature is played upon, is a incredible biblical problem. We have this, which is legalized within Islam, which is 1.5 billion who subscribe to an ideology that permits this type of behavior. Then you have 1.25 billion of the Christian world who are living under a structure which basically endorsed and covered up this behavior. So in this tool bag of me being able to reach the lost sheep of the house of Israel with the gospel, it creates a mountain of objections for me to overcome in being able to witness to my own people, and even reconcile myself to how do I define myself as a Christian. Do I have to have a parenthetical? Do I have to say but afterwards? So I stick to just, I'm a Jewish believer, and that kind of takes me out of the melee of the 30-something thousand denomination of Christianity and these issues with fallen pastors and with sex crimes taking place in the pulpit. Now, you experienced this with a professor that firsthand you have traveled the path of sexual abuse. And your story is woven into the book Denial. But the book Denial really is a chronicle of a journey of a friend that you and your husband met in college, befriended, and I believe, if I'm correct, you learned of the details of the story by examining the journals and the letters and the conversations and being able to rebuild from almost a journalistic perspective what really happened to the man we'll call David Wagner.
Yes, yes. And it's been interesting, I think, as a faith journey, that our stories are intertwined at this point, particularly from the reader's experience of the book. I came to the story after dealing with the lingering effects of my own abuse, that God really called me to account, to address those things, address how they were impacting myself and my relationships, in particular my marriage. And the key lesson that I took away from that season was that sexual abuse is a form of spiritual warfare. It's a very effective one, as you've already laid out, and how prolific it is. And what it does so effectively is separate us, break our ability to experience intimacy, because the childlike intimacy and trust that we extend to the adult who becomes our abuser is warped. And so when the abuser exits, intimacy is the remaining enemy, the remaining threat. And what God showed me was that if I could not experience intimacy and trust and safety in my human love relationships, then I also was hampered in my ability to experience that with Him. And so that's what drew me to look at my friend's story, because I obviously survived and he did not. And I wanted to understand why our paths were different.
You are describing the spirit of Baal. If we are to look at where this originated, the spirit of Baal is a sexual spirit, and it tends to operate most effectively in those organizations, institutions, corporations, congregations who are deeply legalistic.
Yes.
The more you are forbidden from questioning policy and procedure, and the more you're required to conform, sets up this spirit of Baal, which allows for sexual predatory activities, because the structure is, it is beyond question, it is conform, and then it manifests itself as sexual sin. So when we examine Hollywood, for example, okay, the casting couch, you know, the casting couch, when this story broke, and the word casting couch, I did a search on the word casting couch. And the word casting couch has been in our American vocabulary for over 70 years. This is astonishing to me that every adult knows what it means, and yet there has been no outcry until one person was exposed for violating whatever the rules and regulations were of the boundaries of the sanctity of the casting couch. Then we have this violation of the sanctity of the religious institution. In your case, the venerable institution of education, where we subject ourselves to a teacher, an instructor that sets the boundaries and the parameters for performance, and it's now interwoven and the lines are so blurred that we think that we are pursuing righteousness and skill sets, and we find ourselves in a compromising position that has been created as a trap to literally lure us into it and then take advantage, and you were the victim of a predator. And if we don't see this as predatory behavior, and statistically, and I've surveyed 10 of America's most renowned psychiatrists, and pedophilia and sexual abuse are not singular encounters, that they have statistically no documentation of everybody just one time having ever done it, and then having a come to Jesus moment and saying, whoa, I'll never do that again. It's usually repeated, and they put themselves in an environment, and they are driven to be in that environment where they are placed in that position, and find themselves having a large base to draw on. And so it is, you were not the only one that this professor did this to. And David was not the only one that this priest did this to. As you took this journey to write the book, how were you able to navigate two paths that wound up intersecting, and it's almost helical. It's almost like a DNA strand. There are the parallel journeys, then the journeys intertwine, then they twist, and they part again, and they twist and they part again, and then they head off in two completely different directions. You are a survivor. He is passed, took his own life in a way that was passively active. And people have to read the book to see the method he used to take his own life, which is kind of unusual.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say it was done in a closet, which I think is so metaphorically
Yes.
perfect for the setting in which he did take his own life, was in the privacy of a closet. And it's a poignant point, and maybe other readers won't find it as poignant as I did, but I found it incredibly poetic, incredibly poignant, and incredibly revealing. Take me on the journey of how you compiled all of this to be able to tell this true story that's not just David's true story, but it's your true story combined. How did you approach this?
It really was, it was through trying to answer some of those questions, why I survived and he didn't, where God was in his suffering. One of the things that you read in his journals was him repeatedly crying out to the Lord for rescue. And so where was God, and does he care? You know, this is one of those situations where you look at a child being victimized, particularly in a church where God's name and the symbols of our faith are often used as instruments in the hands of evil, right? And I saw a woman in one of the national interviews post this report being released who said the name of God has become a trigger for her because it was used in such a warped way. I think that there are some distinctions between David and me in terms of being male and female. I was a female preyed upon by a male teacher. He was a young boy, just at 12, 13, approaching puberty, preyed upon by an adult man. So that raised difficult questions for him in terms of his sexuality. His physical response to that abuse is a source of great condemnation for a lot of male victims. And I think one of the other significant differences, because his happened in the confines of the church, is he was labeled and became a repeated target. So what started at 12 continued for him throughout high school. Now, at some level, similar to what you said, I think I've been targeted repeatedly too. I think men often take liberties with women in terms of their language, their touch, their approaches. And so when I catalog that in my mind, that's true. But there was only one instance where I was truly sexually abused, where I think there were multiple instances for him. I think women are more likely to talk. Women are more likely to tell somebody. And the shame of being a male assaulted by a man, and add to that the complexity of it being a priest and a family priest who's held in a place of honor in your family, he just was not ever going to talk. And so I named the book Denial because I really believe that the answer to salvation for people who are suffering with this is to speak the truth. Until you say it out loud, the lies are so incredibly powerful. You believe that you're wrong, that you were at fault, that you wanted it, that you're not worthy. And that was really the point of healing for me when I went through therapy a few years ago. Was the last stage was understanding my worth and where it was found. Because for me, the way the abuse manifested throughout my life was being such a pleaser, that the people who were in power over me, my bosses, my instructors, my desire to please them was so great and impossible, right, to please humans, that I would be taken apart. I would just be ruined when I made human mistakes and failures. And I really had to learn and come to peace with the fact that the only place I could look was to God and know the value that I had in his eyes. I think David desired that, and I don't think he was able to find it.
You know, the title Denial, multiple aspects to it. That the victim often denies and doesn't speak about it, and this is a clarion call to speak out. It also is the party line of those who are the perpetrators, is that their defense is denial.
Mm-hmm.
There are the victims who wished it didn't happen, and if I can convince myself to deny it, mm-hmm. then I can reconcile it and it has no power over me. But the fact is once you've been defiled, until you take that place out of darkness and bring it out to the light, you remain defiled, whether you deny it or not. Mm-hmm. And so that really is a part of this story as well. And the title has many, many applications in this particular topic. We're talking with Nanette Kirsch author of the book Denial, Abuse, Addiction, and a Life Derailed, based on a true story, not only Nanette's true story, but the true story of a dear friend who was also physically, sexually abused by someone in authority. And the picture on the front of the book is a roller coaster. And it is a roller coaster of emotions and a roller coaster of trying to understand this culture that exists today, where man has become predatory. That we have not just the Catholic Church, but the Mormon Church, the ideology of Islam, and then those that have not come under the watchful eye of the corporate executive or the corporate manager. Our state government, our federal government, have funds which are set aside to pay off and to cover up the improprieties of those in leadership roles. And this is often a problem where someone in authority is the abuser, and we need to learn how to respond to the question of where is God when somebody in authority, especially a priest, is the abuser. What part does the church play in this? What part does corporate America play in this? What part does, when you assume the role of a leader, what are some of the implied and implicit responsibilities you have to create an environment where this cannot happen? We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to dig into the actual story of the life of two whose paths crossed, who both were the victim of sexual abuse, as we continue our conversation with Nanette Kirsch, author of Denial. We'll be right back. Shalom, I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and I've got a question for you. What do you think they're doing with your DNA? Oh, you know, that 23andMe kit that you sent off, and you got back that report that told you you were Irish, you were French, you were Jewish? Wonder who's interested in that information. It's not like you've sent it off to a database with millions of other people and they can steal your identity, and who would really be interested in that information other than you? Well, maybe your friends and family, but there's one, yes, one, who is so interested in your DNA that it would be something that would make you afraid. And that is Satan himself. Why would Satan be interested in your DNA? Because there is a Y chromosome marker that determines whether or not you are in the line of Aaron. That's right, the biblical line of Aaron the priest. That's because if the priesthood comes back and the high priest takes his role as the head of the Sanhedrin, they will be the ones to call for the return of Jesus. Well, what can they do with your DNA? Well, there are 40-plus countries weaponizing DNA today. And imagine if Satan could weaponize your DNA and use that Y chromosome marker to take out the line of the high priest, then Jesus doesn't come back. That is the plot behind the best-selling book, The Codex, now out in second edition on Kindle, $2.99, also available in paperback. This is a biblical thriller beyond comparison that's going to take you on an incredible journey to understand what they could do with your DNA. I also want to encourage you to visit our website, ignitinganation.com, and click on special offers. There you're going to find the yellow cover of this book, The 7 Laws of Abundant Living, Lessons Learned from the Tree of Life. We're going to take you on a journey in the Garden of Eden to the seed, the ground, all the way out to the fruit that reveals things of the natural, that God is trying to reveal supernatural truths. Contained within these pages are 7 laws and 7 lessons within each law. They're going to take you on an incredible journey of understanding about the life you live and the fruit you bear. I want to encourage you to click on that yellow cover. We're going to ask for your email. Now, we won't send you spam because spam is not kosher, but we will send you the first chapter of this book. I want to encourage you to get 7 Laws of Abundant Living, Lessons Learned from the Tree of Life. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on Barnes & Noble. You can get it Books A Million, wherever great Christian books are sold. Take this journey with me to the Tree of Life in the Garden of Eden and to the Tree of Life we see again at the River of Life. Get your copy today. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Nanette Kirsch, author of Denial, abuse, addiction, and a life derailed based on a true story, her story and the story of a friend very close to her. Nanette, we are blessed to have you come out on the other side of this, where the main character of the book, David, did not survive and was not able to live with the abuse that was perpetrated upon him. So welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
There is a mandate, a clarion call, that those who are aware that organizations, congregations, industries, and people of power are perpetrating these crimes upon other people, they have a responsibility to get up, stand up, and see something, know something, and say something. And I don't see that happening. I don't see the outrage. Now, I'm a Penn State alum, and I was there during some of those years. I did not bear witness, nor did I have any knowledge of what was going on, but there was an outrage. There was an outrage by the NCAA. There was an outrage by the college licensing and accreditation community. There was court, even the revered Joe Paterno was implicated in this, even posthumously, that he had knowledge. There are cases now where people are investigating that how could you not have knowledge? Are there cover-ups going on in all kinds of places in corporate America? Are there people who are being dismissed, but yet the crime of sexual abuse, and it is a crime, is not being prosecuted. It is not being identified as such, and people are so committed to the institution that they are actually empowering and endorsing the behavior by staying. And I'm a person that says, listen, if I see behavior, and Paul, the one known as Saul, Rabbi Shaul, wrote very clearly in Scripture, in his letter to Timothy, that if you hear a Jesus being preached that's not the Jesus I preached to you, run. If you hear a Holy Spirit being preached to you that's not the Holy Spirit that I preached to you, run. If you hear a Jesus that's not the same Jesus that I preached to you, then run. Why is this or not this mass exodus from Hollywood, the mass exodus from the Catholic Church, the mass exodus from the industries that are being exposed that this is rampant? The United States Senate, the United States Congress that has a fund set up for politicians to pay hush money or to pay off people that they have been accusations levied against them. Where is the outcry, and where is America, and why the silence? Because I have a 29-year-old daughter, right, and she has a 1 in 10, maybe even a 1 in 4 probability, possibility that she will either be the victim of sexual or physical abuse before she finishes out her life. This is appalling to me. It is way too silent. There's way too much huddling around and protecting, and there needs to be a tearing down. The fact that if a president of a corporation had 150 managers who were identified and prosecuted in his organization, he would be terminated as the president. Why is the church not terminating the president? Why are they not terminating the people who had organizations where this was going on? Why is there not a rampant change in leadership and management and a complete overhaul of what we consider to be the venerable traditional Roman Catholic Church? Why is there not this outcry in the world that says tear down the walls and bring these people into accountability? And it's trickling out. And if it happened in the Archdiocese of Boston, in the Archdiocese of Pittsburgh, these were not unique cases.
That's right.
The Archdiocese of Chicago, the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, The fact that the church had places that they sent alcoholic priests to go be alcoholics with other alcoholic priests, that they sent sex offenders to other locations where other sex offenders would be, that they actually housed them and they co-located them, so at least they were able to herd them and watch over them while it still went on in those parishes, is appalling to me.
Appalling.
But nevertheless, this is not the purpose of your book. Okay?
Right.
And I want to be clear about that, that this is not a condemnation of the Catholic Church, but it is a condemnation of this behavior and the life that it took and the life of one who struggled with it. So what can we do? This is a problem. It's statistically a problem. It is a chronic, and I have to also sidebar by saying that God said this day was going to come, that there is going to be lawlessness, there's going to be sexual debauchery, there's going to be sexual immorality, there's going to be people who are lovers of themselves, which I defined as a man loves a man, a woman loves a woman. We're seeing the rise in the LGBT environment. There's so many things in this world today that are so skewed that God's telling us that these are signs of the times. And so the theologian in me says, well, all is well with my soul because everything is as God said it was going to be. We would return to the Sodom and Gomorrah. We would be the dog that returns to the vomit. We would be the condition of the days of Noah when God brought about the flood. So in one area, God's sovereignty is allowing this to happen to call for the return of the Messiah and for all of this to be defeated. But on the other hand, I can't sit quietly by, nor can you, and allow this to happen to one more person without speaking out about it. So what can we do?
I think it's a great point. I think the point of my story was not to attack the church. There's plenty of news and other things that do that. The point and the message of my story was to help people who have been victimized understand what they can do to change the direction of their lives and improve their survival and return to a close relationship with God, which is the only hope that any of us have. And then for people who haven't been directly impacted, to really step into understanding the impact of abuse. There's only one chapter in my book that talks about the actual sexual abuse that happened and tries to anchor the rest of the story in that. This is a man whose life, from outward purposes, was widely successful. He was a millionaire by 35. He had the perfect family. He, had a great job. He was a very visible, funny, engaging human being. And the fact of the matter is, no one had any idea the suffering that he had gone through or the sinfulness in which he was engaged until he died. And sin begets sin. The tension, one of the other tensions for me in writing the story is a childhood of sexual abuse led to an adulthood of sexual addiction, of, infidelities and pornography and prostitution and things that if you only knew that, you would say, wow, this is a despicable human being, but it wasn't. And I think we need to dig deeper and realize that we all have sinned, that sin begets sin, and start to understand those root causes. And so, this man left 5 children behind whom he loved dearly, whom he was a good father to within the capacity he had. And I wanted them to understand that. I thought, these are difficult truths, but if you can put those pieces together and understand how that deep brokenness, unresolved, just perpetuates it in our world, then I think it helps create an environment for change. And as far as people who are in the church, I think that what's incumbent on them is not to remain silent. Church attendance in the Roman Catholic Church in Pittsburgh is down 40%. People are leaving. I have a very dear friend who is Irish Catholic, grew up as a Catholic missionary. She and her husband have made the decision that they can no longer stay in the church. They're leaving. And I specifically define myself as a follower of Jesus. I subscribe to the gospel that you shared, that I follow him, I follow the biblical teaching, and I don't put my trust and faith in any organizational religion because they're human beings and they're fallen across all denominations. But once you know, it's incumbent to speak up. So it is not okay to say my priest didn't do it. Within the Diocese of Pittsburgh, within these dioceses where this is being exposed, there is no justification for remaining silent. If you continue to go to church and give your money you're funding the payoffs. And so, again, I think there's very good people. I have very dear friends and family members who are committed to the Catholic faith, and I can respect that, but I cannot respect it if they don't continue to advocate for change. And the great point you made is there's no accountability in the church. Since this scandal is broken, the Pope has said silence is truth. The truth is never silent until the person's so sinful they're refusing to listen to the gospel truth, right? He's spoken biblical untruths and refused to remove people who are responsible. Cardinal Wuerl of the Archdiocese of D.C. is directly implicated in these cover-ups. He's had retirement on the Pope's death since he turned 75, and that's been accepted with a note that talked about how he continued to put the interests of the people first. It's simply not true, and it's offensive to the people who have been harmed in this. So again, that's not my battle, but it is my battle cry to people who are in the church is if you're going to stay, you have to be a voice for change.
Let's talk right now to our audience that's been abused and has kept it a secret, that they've stuffed it down and they've seen it manifest in broken relationships, they've seen it manifest in infidelity, they've seen it in unjustified outbursts that they don't know where it came from. I've heard that many times. I have no idea where that came from. That's not the person that I am. Or their wording is aggressive in certain ways, or deflecting, or making every effort to shift the spotlight off themselves and on to another. When you shared with your husband, not at the start of your marriage, I don't believe, but later on in your marriage, when you began to manifest certain changes in behavior in yourself, not that they were changing, but you were becoming aware that something was impacting your relationship. When you came to terms and addressed this, what advice do you have for people to take that step to say, you know that it happened, but you don't know what it's doing to you, and the fallout from it is a much larger circle than you can even imagine. You're at the center of it, you're the nucleus of it, and the abuse is right there in the center of all of it. And regardless of whether or not you realize that you've unintentionally built walls and barriers and responses and attitudes which have great and long-lasting impact. How do you get to that point of not denial, but what would you call it?
Yeah, I think living in the light of truth. The biggest lie I told myself was I wasn't impacted by it. It was 37 years later when I finally saw the effect. I had looked at it. I had been to 2 other counselors previously, and I think that's one of my encouragements to survivors is don't give up. There's a lot of really bad counselors out there who are not equipped to deal with sexual abuse survivors who don't understand the trauma. Don't give up and don't believe you're not affected. And when I finally, again, at my husband's encouragement, decided to really try to understand God's view of sexuality and found a Christian counselor who helped to coach me through understanding the brokenness that I still had, the ways that I shared with you that it showed up in my life from a work perspective. And most painfully for me was the harm that I had done, the damage I had caused in my marriage to my husband by not allowing him to be as close to me as he wanted to be, that I wanted to keep him at a safe distance, physically, emotionally, every other way, because it just didn't feel safe to me. That's not okay to do to somebody. And so I actually had to repent of that and apologize to him. And that was one of the harder days of therapy, but I think one of the more healing. And it's no different from what David went through, that, it took him years until almost the end of his life to start to connect that the behaviors that he was exhibiting were tied back to his abuse. And I think that was the beginning of his healing. I just think it came very late in the game, and there were too many other pieces falling. But all of us carry some baggage, as you said, from physical abuse, from whatever traumatic things have happened in our lives. Sexual abuse is unique, and it's disruption to our closest relationships. And so own that, find somebody who can hear it, who understands it, and take responsibility to get better and do better.
You worked very closely with David's wife in this project. going through the journals, going through his writings, being able to identify patterns, encounters, a chronicle of this journey through his life, even all the way to the end. What was this like for her? And I want to point out that the afterword in the book is written by his wife.
Mm-hmm.
And that is incredibly powerful, that kind of wraps this up in a very profound way. But taking this journey alongside of her and being able to minister to her because of your own experience, I know that you were able to do that and to bring some clarity to her, because she couldn't have this conversation with her husband. He wasn't there anymore. And so in almost a surrogate way, God used you as his voice to help her navigate through some of the ramifications of his abuse. So how did that develop, and how is that bond today?
That's such an interesting insight, Eric. You're so right. Our bond is very close. She's one of my dearest friends, and we talk several times a week. What was interesting to me and really humbling was it was 4 years after he died before I was called to write the book, and I had traveled with boxes of things she had sent me. She asked me to write the book the year that he died. She released that to me physically, and I think as she released it to me physically, she started to release it emotionally and mentally. So when I told her I was going to write the book and the faith-based perspective I wanted to take, she really wasn't there, but she approved me doing it, and she let it go. She helped me get in touch with people who I wanted to interview for the story. She supported me. Believe it or not, she never read the manuscript until it was done. And I thought that was such an act of faith and trust, and I held that, in very high esteem. I still do, that she entrusted me with that. What ended up happening was I was living in that story every day. I built a timeline. I was talking to people. I was sorting through documentation, putting things together in order so I could figure out how I wanted to stitch this story together. And she was always available, but it was almost as if she gave it to me, that she released that story and that burden. And you have to understand, she was living in the fallout of incredible trauma. Yes, her husband died, but prior to her husband dying, that was clearly not a healthy relationship. They both were very broken. She, after his death, started to struggle and still does struggle with alcoholism and substance abuse. And she was a single mother, taken from a very high level of wealth to near poverty in an instant, trying to keep 5 kids alive and prospering and functioning. And so she didn't have time to focus on her past. She had a lot of anger, a lot of hurt, a lot of pain. But I did watch God work through the journey of the story. And as we got to the end and got ready to go to market with it, I heard her say things like, he never had a first date. He never had a first kiss. Like, he was robbed of everything and never really got to be fully who God created him to be. That's an act of mercy. That's God's Spirit softening her heart. And she's been able to have conversations with her kids as they've gotten old enough that they want to read this story and put the pieces together, where everybody's had an opportunity to process and grieve together and really mourn in a heartfelt way what happened to their father with a lot of love. And that to me, if nobody else read the book, I feel like I did what God called me to do.
This book is a book of tragedy, but it's a book of reconciliation, although after the fact. In your life, you were able to live through the reconciliation through a lot of work, a lot of therapy, and a husband who loved you through it in spite of all of it. Not knowing that the person that he was married to wasn't the person that he was married to. And so you're a new wife to him, the better version of yourself, because you've been able to address this. David's wife never knew that. And I'm sure that in that struggle, blamed herself for a lot of his behaviors and a lot of the problems in the relationship. This is one of the most motivating reasons why this must be taken out of the darkness and brought into the light. That
Yeah.
the sooner it happens, the less damage is done, and the more healing that can take place, and more reconciliation there can be. And we serve the God of reconciliation. We're actually called as believers to be ministers of reconciliation. What is the hope on the other side of this diabolical, ongoing, ever increasing, and ever more exposed? And you know, the question would be, is it happening more, or is it just being exposed more? And the answer is yes.
Right.
It is happening more, and it is being exposed more, and it's not being exposed at the same rate in which it is increasing, because people are taking more liberties, and what we would now call consensual is now the word that's debated as to what is consensual, and
Right.
a jury has to decide on the definition of the word consensual based on the presentation of the environment in which the abuse occurred. This is horrifying to me that we've now become Merriam-Webster in the definition of the violation of a man or a woman's body. It's horrendous. But what is the hope on the other side of this we want to leave, as we only have about a minute left in this interview, that we want to leave the audience with?
Yep, I think the hope is that victims do speak up. One of the things I learned through the report and the things that have happened since this book came out is that many times victims come forward. So now we know, and it's incumbent on us to do better. The hope in the story of David Wagner and that family is that I do believe God was with him. I do believe that God heard his heart, and I do believe he's with the Lord. And I watch his legacy played out in the lives of his children. And what we count in terms of the profit of the book are the stories that come back to us of people who have been positively impacted, people who have sought help after being abused, or who have confided in someone for the first time. There was a woman at my book launch who was 77 who gave me a hug and said, "Me too," before it became a hashtag. And it was the first time she had disclosed that. That for me is hope. And I think for those kids, I hope that those stories redeem their dad for them, that they know his life was not wasted.
Well, in God's economy, no life is wasted, and he's the one who can redeem any life from any circumstances, regardless of what your part was in it. If you are the perpetrator, then God has a plan of salvation and redemption for you, and a plan of healing for you, but it requires repentance and a complete change of heart for you as the abuser. For you who are the victim, my heart goes out to you, but God's heart goes out to you as well. And he's calling for you to turn to him to find the comfort that you cannot find in this earth through another person. It's only through a relationship with him. And for those of you that know of someone, this book will equip you as to how to speak with them, how to converse with them, how to relate to them, and how to listen to their story without judging and without being the jury. You are neither the judge nor the jury, but you are called to come alongside of those who have been victims of this abuse, meaning in your circle of 10 friends, a minimum of 1 have experienced this. Know that you are surrounded by people who have been hurt at the hands of another, and be a comforter, be a friend, be a listener, be an encourager, and help guide them to get the help that they need. But share with them first the gospel and the love of God. Nanette Kirsch, author of Denial, Abuse, Addiction, and a Life Derailed, a true story of her own and of David Wagner. Thank you so much for your transparency and for being with us here on Revealing the Truth.
Thank you, Eric.
God bless you, my friend. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.